Bruce, you and Chris Vanini did the college football coaching tiers, which also another massive undertaking to rank these. You guys talked to a lot of different people in the industry to get their opinions on where these guys rank. And of course, the top tier is pretty straightforward. Nick Saban at Alabama, Kirby Smart, Dabo Swinney. And then I think when you get further down in the tiers, it gets a lot more difficult to differentiate between these guys. And Bruce, I'll start with this question. Which coaches in doing the tiers were the toughest calls when you guys were figuring out where to slot everybody?
To me, the hardest one is James Franklin in this case. I would make the case that he was in with the Luke Fickles and in that group. Because again, and maybe I give him too much credit for the first job he did, which was Vanderbilt, but Vanderbilt was atrocious for like 6 decades. He went in there and he had two top 25 seasons out of 3. He leaves and then they're awful again. And he goes to Penn State and he's had a bunch of 11-win seasons. I get why there's hesitation on him to put him in the upper echelon because they are third behind Ohio State and Michigan. And they've had a bunch of head-to-heads and they've won very few of them, and that's the reality. Now, look, I think they're trending upward, but I get why there's a lot of people whenever I put him in the top 6 who are like, I don't buy that. He's like top 15 maybe. But I just, again, I don't know how many other coaches like. I think Lincoln Riley and Ryan Day are terrific coaches and terrific offensive minds. But Ryan Day took over from Urban Meyer, and that thing was rolling. And he basically kept the best parts of Urban Meyer's, staff, and they've sustained. But again, they've had issues now with their arch rival. Lincoln Riley took over for Bob Stoops, and he had it rolling, and he's terrific with quarterbacks, obviously. And then he went to USC and took over a bad situation, but obviously brought in elite talent, and they got really good on offense. So I get it, but at the same time, I'm not sure either one of those guys would have been able to do what James Franklin did at Vanderbilt either. So for me, that's the toughest one. And then you start getting into like guys who are really, had a really good year or something. Like, what do you do with Willie Fritz? Like he's done really well at smaller divisions, and last year had a breakout year at Tulane. But beyond that, it was like, okay, would I say he's one of the 10 best coaches in the country? Probably not. I would probably give, Chris Kleiman and Lance Leipold more credit for what I think they've done, but it's nitpicky. And you hate to kind of ding some of these guys who are really good because you're, trying to like leverage one guy over another.
Bruce, when you look at that list too, I know for a lot of these guys towards the top, you've got real, career resumes and recent success that you can kind of weigh it on. I'm sure it's always tough when you take guys with small resumes and you're kind of trying to figure out where do we slot them. Obviously, you guys are higher on like John Summerall from Troy and Kane Womack from South Alabama, but then it seemed like with some of these, you've like Joey McGuire and Marcus Freeman are on one of the lower tiers. Obviously, they're new to this, but then you have Brent Venables below them on a lower tier. And I'm curious, like, kind of how you sort some of these guys that maybe you think the arrow is pointing in the right direction, but you also don't really know, that it's just too few games to judge a guy too.
Yeah, I think Joey McGuire, and you guys know him better than I do personally, but like, it's impressive what he's done in a short amount of time there. And again, it's Texas Tech. They had really good teams when Mike was coaching it, and then they've been kind of underwhelming for a while, right? They haven't been a top 15 kind of team or a top 20 caliber team. They honestly haven't been nationally relevant, really. And you compare that against what Brent Venables did. I thought Brent was a terrific defensive coordinator, but that's not the ask here. We're talking about head coaches. That team was a big disappointment last year. And we'll see if, he's recruiting well. But again, it's about what's on the field right now. If you told me they're going to win 10 games, like, okay, because that's what basically they've been doing for a long time in Norman, Oklahoma. Basically, that was the worst year since John Blake era, right? And so I don't know how you measure that up. And you talk about Marcus Freeman has recruited well, but they had a really I was not disappointed in how they played against Ohio State. They were competitive in that, but then you lose to Marshall, you lose to some really mediocre teams last year. And so I think, that's kind of where it is. For me, and I'm not, and as I say, I'm not doing it. I'm about to be doing it. I was gonna say, I'm not going to throw Chris under the bus because he's not here for that. But
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
But like,
he's not here to defend himself. Let him go.
Yeah, sorry. But like, if you ask me, I would not have Tom Herman on the same level.
That was an interesting one. Yeah.
I would not have Tom Herman on the same level with James Franklin, Lance Leipold, or Chris Kleiman.
You have him on tier 3 with, basically all top 25 caliber coaches. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah, because he's accomplished a lot. Accomplished a decent bit. I shouldn't say accomplished a lot, but he had 2 really good teams at Houston. Mm-hmm. And then he took Texas to its only 10-win season that we've seen in the last 13 years. But of course, it kind of lost momentum in the last 2 years and then left, I think, what you would consider a really poorly managed roster for his successor. So when you take all that into consideration, like, I can see where I think his ceiling is really high, but his body of work, especially when it's considered 4 years at Texas, good, but not great. And I think so definitely enough flaws that you could make an argument that, he doesn't belong with a Mac Brown who's won a national championship, or a Sonny Dykes who just took his team to the national championship game.
No, and
Bruce, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sam.
I was going to say, if there's a guy down the list here, I'm just interested. I'm looking at tier 7, tier 6. If there's a guy that you think is like, when you do this a year from now with Chris, are there some guys you kind of circle as you think they're going to blast up the list, like a Dan Lanning or Marcus Freeman, or some guys that maybe are on the younger end? Obviously, you've got some fairly bigger names in tier 5 here, like Steve Sarkisian, like Shane Beamer, Dave Aranda. Are there some guys that you kind of circle as like, I can't do it yet, but you think that they're going to be pretty high tier guys here in the next few years?
Yeah, I think John Sumrall is a guy. He only had 1 year, did an amazing job at Troy. I think he's going to be an SEC head coach before too long. Like Dan Lanning, there's a lot to like there. I'll be honest, on Sark, he's definitely made it better if you look at what they've done in the trenches and everything, but we still need to see it translate on the field to consistency. I think the thing that right now is keeping him from, being considered a top 25 coach is he took Washington when he got there. They were horrible, and he made them respectable, and he did it pretty quick. The problem was they really never got any better than that, or didn't get much better. And then he went to USC and he was a disaster. So, I mean, coaches can evolve. But we need to see certainly a lot more, and I want to see it now before that. I mean, there's a few guys in there where you're like, okay, what is this guy? What's the direction? I think when you look at Neil Brown, he's a guy we all know. He did really well at Troy and got to West Virginia. And I don't know if it's just been a bad fit. He took over from Dana, who's really, really smart offensive mind. But like when Neil got there, it was almost like everybody was leaving with Dana at that time. So it wasn't a really great situation. The other guy I think is trending upward. He's had 2 years. He was a really good assistant. Is Charles Huff at Marshall. I could see him keep winning and then bouncing out of Marshall to a Power 5 or whatever we're calling big schools, when that happens. I think he's a guy to watch as well.
It's interesting. You look at tier 2, it's such an established group: Ryan Day, Luke Fickell, Jimbo Fisher, Jim Harbaugh, Brian Kelly, Lincoln Riley, Kyle Whittingham. It's interesting. I know you want James Franklin to be in that group, but you go down that next group. It's interesting to kind of try to look at this and predict who's that next guy that moves up into that list. Is it a Chris Kleiman? Is it a Sonny Dykes? Is it a Mario Cristobal getting things established at Miami? I think there's definitely some interesting candidates there.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Sonny, because I think, we all know him, and Sonny is one who I think has definitely evolved, from the Sonny who was the assistant, and he's super smart, and then he did well at La Tech, and then he goes out to Cal, and I think he really had to go to workshop it after he got out of there. And I think he's in a really good situation at TCU. I could definitely see him, keep elevating. Of those guys. Chris Kleiman is another one who, when I
should have mentioned Josh Heupel too. Josh Heupel's probably in that conversation at this point too.
And Josh Heupel, honestly, a year ago at this time wouldn't have been anywhere near that conversation.
Right. Yeah.
Like 1 year, and I don't want to call him a 1 year wonder because he did fine taking over for Scott Frost. But when he left there, I felt like the program was backsliding. And then he got to Tennessee and he got them out of the ditch. And that program was in a huge ditch. So we'll see. I mean, look, if Joe Milton can do what the wow factor can translate into production and consistency, then man, he could be not the first tier, but he could be in that tier with maybe the Ryan Days and the Lincoln Rileys. The one who I don't know if there's a discussion on, but like Jimbo, to me, is like he's got the national title, but he's done next to nothing in College Station for a long time now. And so I struggle with Jimbo. Like Stu and I were like, I felt like Stu was more down on Jimbo than I was, but I was not too far from where he was, given how bad they were last year. There's no reason Texas A&M should have been as bad as they were last year. I mean, I'm curious. I'm fascinated how this is going to work out with Bobby Petrino and the egos involved there.
Yeah, I was curious about that because Jimbo's a guy who's won a national championship. He had a terrific run at Florida State, and we're getting
close to a decade now since the championship.
Yeah, yeah,
right?
it's 10 years away, and he had really one really good season at A&M, which was 2020 when they finished fourth and they just missed the playoff, fifth in the playoff rankings. But since then, they've trended downward. So, and like you said, just going 5-7 last year, I think it's one thing to have a tough year. It's a whole other thing to go 5-7 and lose, as many in a row as they did. So, I was fascinated by how you guys figured out, okay, he's going to end up being tier 2. And what point does the recent results factor into him sliding back a little bit?
Yeah, that was one. If it was just mine, I probably would have had him down another tier. I could see, he does have a national title, but like he's been worse than this stretch at Texas A&M than Kevin Sumlin was, and they fired Kevin Sumlin. Was shoved him out the door. And I don't know how you look at Texas A&M. Again, I don't want to hijack the podcast with this, but like if he wins he goes 8-4. I know what the buyout is, but if he goes 8-4, I don't know how you tell a fan base, yeah, this is going to go where we think it needs to go. Like, because they've been 8-4 or some version of 8-4 for like 30 years. Right? I mean, yeah. Sam, you lived down there, and
Kevin, I think, had 3 8-4 seasons in a row, and then eventually I think went 7-5 the last year, and that was what got him run out. But yeah, it's been a program. They've only won 9 games or more, I believe, if I remember Chris correctly, from the summer 6 times since '98, I think, something like that. There's not a program that wins 9 or 10 games on a regular basis.